With that, we're going to pivot to someone who is an advocate, the Director of Advocacy for the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. And we are members, I have been for, 30 years, of the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. And in fact, if he's out there in the audience, Peter Strauss is one of the founders of NAELA. And Peter has had an illustrious career in elder law and was one of the founders of this group. David works in Washington, and NAELA is a nonprofit organization that advocates for older adults and those with disabilities. They've had some legislative successes, extending Medicaid spousal impoverishment protections because they were being scrutinized very, very heavily. And also something that was a long haul, but the Special Needs Trust Fairness Act was directly a result of NAELA's efforts in advocacy with Congress. With that, I'd like to bring David on. Good morning, David. Welcome to the Elder Law Forum.
Hi, Lou. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with all my New York partners. I am not related to David Goldfarb in New York, the famous elder law attorney, but if your last name's Goldfarb, there's a good chance your first name is going to be David. So we share that name with many individuals. It's also great to follow Senator Gillibrand. In fact, one of the first issues I worked on at NAELA coming to the organization was the Disabled Military Child Protection Act, which for those that are in the S&T world allowed assignment for a military pension to an S&T. She was the lead on that. And so it's great to follow her here today. I'm going to get my slides going. So I'm here today to update you on current developments and really sort of where we are on these big questions and some of the smaller questions around long-term care. Lou mentioned NAELA. So, one of the important things I want to mention for many of the elder law attorneys in the room is there's a big focus, obviously, in your practice on community and education. But one of the unique things about NAELA is we really are the only organization that provides your insight and your expertise to members of Congress and regulators here in DC. There is no one else. Lou already talked about some of the examples. I'll highlight a couple more that really relate to New York State. One, for instance, was stopping limits to home equity. They were going to take away that state option, and New York's one of the few states that allowed home equity to be exempt for Medicaid purposes above that federal minimum. More recently, we worked on things like getting that POMS retracted on legal fee approval for S&T drafting, getting S&Ts protected in that new inherited IRA payout. And as Lou mentioned, and I think that is important, given that spousal refusal is always under threat in your state, the federal mandate must apply to HCBS waivers. We've gotten that through 2023. But I want to talk a little bit to set the context about where we are now in terms of long-term care reform. And as you'll see, you're going to hear a lot about HCBS right now. Now, in early 2016, we saw long-term care financing discussions, how to pay for the catastrophic care come back, sort of post-Class Act, which was that voluntary program in the ACA. But then the first unexpected thing happened, and that was Trump was elected. Everyone was having these conversations thinking Hillary Clinton was going to be president. It was going to be maybe a bipartisan Congress or some kind of mix. So trying to think of bipartisan ideas. But importantly, it wasn't just Trump who was elected, but it was a unified government. And they went directly to trying to reform the ACA, and as part of that, completely restructuring the Medicaid program. What that meant was all of the energy in DC and AARP, Leading Age, the SCAN Foundation, the Urban Institute, Milliman, there is some big money being placed into long-term care financing discussions to really tackle the issue. Went to how do we save the current system with per capita caps, eligibility cuts being proposed in that first year. And then from there, luckily we had, that did not go through, but the fight continued with the attempt to redefine Medicaid under Section 1115 waivers. Now, New York is under a Section 1115 waiver because it's doing managed care, but this was really to push the bounds of what you could do in Section 1115. Section 1115 basically says you can change the contract between the federal government, who will provide the money, and the states who are going to provide the services. You can change that contract, and it's up to the HHS secretary to approve it. It's potentially very broad, but there was litigation showing that no, this must promote coverage, not just things like promoting health. It was scheduled to be at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was interested in this issue to move forward with things like eligibility restrictions, work requirements, getting rid of retroactive coverage. When Biden took over, they were able to get those waivers pulled, and it fell out of the Supreme Court. We have a great decision at the DC Court of Appeals, but that battle is not over and will continue. And that's going to be a major question going forward in the future, as long as we're operating under the Medicaid program for long-term care. After the first 2 years, which was a big battle around Medicaid in Congress, we did come back and start to get and see bipartisan success around HCBS. Although there were major disagreements on the financing of Medicaid, we found that home and community-based services was a real winner, both on the Republican and Democratic side. But as we were working on that, then another unexpected event happened, and I don't have to tell you in New York State what that was, which is COVID-19 and the tragedy that was taking place in nursing homes that we saw. Not just the deaths, but the total lack of ability to visit your loved ones, so people were literally dying of isolation. With that came major state budget shortfalls. And so when we get to today, the focus is all on HCBS, home and community-based services, how to keep people at home, both because of the bipartisan interest, but also because of, I think, what happened in COVID. And Senator Gillibrand mentioned the HCBS Access Act, which I don't have a slide on, but that is a proposal that NAELA has been working on with her and Senator Casey to totally transform the long-term care system to ensure that everyone can get home and community-based services. I will say it's an extremely, extremely expensive proposal. However, we hope that some good policy ideas will come out of it. Just some recent policy changes to be aware of, in particular how it relates to New York State, and I'm sure that a lot of this was covered in the prior. I know that that Governor Cuomo is looking to implement these cuts, particularly related to home and community-based services. I heard about the look back. I understand there's a consumer-directed program that's a big one, talking to Lou in upstate New York. Because of the state budget shortfalls, the Family First Act included a 6.2% bump for Medicaid, and NAELA was very involved in lobbying and coalition to get these kinds of funds, and importantly, fighting for a maintenance of effort requirement. We were also very engaged when the Trump administration tried to redefine what maintenance of effort meant. And they could really mess around with benefit levels. However, eligibility, I think, is pretty clear. They can't do that as long as we're in this public health emergency. And I think that's where you're getting that January 1st date. We also worked on getting states eligible for, in the American Rescue Plan, that's that first reconciliation package, the first big package with all the stimulus checks from President Biden, an optional benefit for states for 1 year as a 10% FMAP boost for home and community-based services. And again, if your state wants to take that, it's got to supplement, it can't supplant, so it can't be to make up for those cuts. But again, there's another maintenance of effort requirement in that. So pay attention to whether New York is looking to take that on. We also worked on getting money follows the person. Again, you're going to see a theme here, HCBS. That's the program that pays for transition services to get people out of nursing homes. We've mentioned the spousal impoverishment protection, so I'll skip that. And you heard about another important but small policy around direct service support professionals. Another small but interesting development that NAELA got involved with that I want to flag is that there is actually a sea change now, I think, post-ACA reform. You've seen Republicans now, for instance, focus on drug pricing, surprise medical billing. They're moving away from we need to reform entitlements, at least for now. And so MACPAC which is the Medicaid CHIP Access Commission that advises Congress. It's bipartisan, with NAELA providing both technical expertise and then joining in coalition, has recommended to Congress that estate recovery be optional for states. And I'm sure the second one might be an issue in New York, which is that they have to charge the capitated payment rate regardless amount for estate recovery, regardless of the amount of services that's been offered. So we have instances of people like SSI beneficiaries who have parents who've gotten no services, and they'll get a $200,000 bill for estate recovery. They say fix that, implement minimum hardship standards. So that's something that could happen, maybe not this year because the focus is not on healthcare per se, but potentially next year. So we've heard a little bit about, and I'm sure it was mentioned previously, the $400 billion for home and community-based services in the American Jobs Plan. All right, I am excited. $400 billion, that's a lot of money. But there's one question. This dog has a question. What is in this $400 billion? The answer is no one knows. It hasn't been written yet. We're working with stakeholders and policymakers to try to shape that. But what I can say is that it's most likely going to be some kind of grant program to states. It's going to be a bazooka of money. One of the challenges is going to be is that bazooka of money might fall off a cliff after 10 years. A couple important elements to understand when we look at it. Note that it's in the American Jobs Plan and not in Biden's other major proposal, the American Families Plan. At the end of the day, this is really about improving the workforce, improving the wages of those workers, which is such a big issue, and then services, and then lowering wait lists, and a whole bunch of other things. So it sort of remains to be seen. We just got news that they can only do one reconciliation package, and reconciliation is that process that allows the party in power in the Senate to avoid the filibuster. They can only do one more this year, and so the pressure is on for these negotiations now, and the clock is really ticking between him trying to cut a deal with Republicans on infrastructure, and this is all part of infrastructure. This counts as infrastructure. And whether they're going to do one with them and then a separate reconciliation package, or they're going to drop and do just a Democratic one, we don't know. But I will say that President Biden sent a letter to the Republican negotiators saying this $400 billion must be in any package. So we're excited about that from that perspective. NAELA is also taking a look at, they're proposing this major amount of money, and we're working with Justice and Aging in particular to say, we need some permanent things in this if we can get it. We need to ask. And we have a list of things to try to pitch, but the one we really gravitated around that we think could fit really well is the issue that for home and community-based services, there's a lot of work that has to be done just to get care. When you go into a nursing home, you get care immediately. You don't need all these assessments done. That can take, I'm not sure about New York State, but in other states, it can take weeks and months. And so people who could qualify aren't, and they're ending up in institutions. There's also court cases, as you might know, that have said, no, they don't have to cover retroactive coverage. So we're looking at trying to solve that with Justice and Aging and making that pitch for this $400 billion. So that's an exciting project I'm working on right now. The other thing that really excites me, and this is something that perhaps has gone from a 0% chance for the last 2 decades to, maybe a 10% chance. I'm not, probability is really mathematically uncertain, but there is talk about the potential for some SSI expansion in this package or perhaps the next package. But to be clear, expanding the benefit level for SSI is extremely expensive. If you take it to get to the federal poverty level, which is where, at a minimum it should be, that would cost around $250 billion, which would require offsets in raising taxes. So there is some potential I do see to raise the asset limit modestly, get rid of in-kind support and maintenance, fix the marriage penalty, a lot of smaller but important items for your SSI beneficiaries. So we'll be working on that in coalition. The ARC is one of the major groups spearheading that, and I'm really pleased to join them on those efforts. When we look at the future of long-term care financing, and then Lou, I think we might have some time for some Q&A and some dialogue. How I try to think about, what is the political future? Obviously, everyone knows about the aging population, and particularly that the 85 plus is the fastest growing population in the United States. But we also have major state budget constraints, and the politics of revenue increases has been extremely fraught and difficult. And so the states, just like New York State, are under extreme duress to make these decisions. That's going to be another thing that's going to play into constraints on Medicaid. We're seeing this possible move starting with Trump and even like the Bernie wing, but frankly with Biden going big. Is economic populism back? Are we moving away from the politics of Clinton and Reagan to a new form of politics? We really don't know yet, because we could be at the very beginning of that. That could have broad implications. And then within that, big undertakings, where does long-term care fall as a priority? There are many big things that Congress wants to do. Where does long-term care really fall? Frankly, generally speaking, Congress does things best when they're dealing with a crisis. And so it might have to be, and I know we know that it's a crisis, but it has to be a really bad crisis for them to deal with it. And then, and I look forward to joining the breakout sessions later, could it be Medicaid expansion, Medicare expansion, cash benefit, public private? It could be all the above, none of the above. It's really way out in the open right now for how we're going to fix this. And I do love the New York Compact. I think it's a great idea. And I think you could see elements of that as we move forward. So with that, Lou, I think we might have some time to answer some questions or
Sure, I have a couple, David, and thank you for the presentation and the insights into what's happening in Washington. What I always find is that there is always a lot of great rhetoric and great words about policy, but then when it comes time to actually create a program and put the dollars to it, that's where the roadblock comes. And people will spend 3 years, 4 years, 5 years developing that policy and then figure out the program doesn't work. With regard to home and community-based services, we already have some infrastructure there. And home HCBS is the buzzword of the day, and that's where the money is all being deployed. So everyone has to know what home and community-based services are. But the Olmstead Act has been around and been with us since George W. He signed the Olmstead Act. Mm-hmm. But there has been lip service paid to the enforcement of bringing people home and keeping them in their homes. Do you see a sea change there?
Well, one of the things, and actually I should say your New York senators are both leaders. The problem with the ADA and then the Olmstead Act is the dollars issue. Again, it's civil rights legislation, no discrimination. But even within the Olmstead ruling, there are limits, in terms of forcing states. So, for instance, we were very interested in bringing a case, working with our members in Maryland, who have a wait list of 70,000 people. Of course, it takes 7 years to get off this wait list. And by the way, whenever they say your number's up, the person's no longer living. So it's not really a wait list.
Or they're in a nursing home by then.
They're in a nursing home by then, and they're never going to get out. And MFP, money follows the person, is meant as a backstop. So there has to be more done. The law, Olmstead is not enough to force states to invest. And unfortunately, many states view HCBS, because of how it is optional. And the thing you mentioned about dollars, understand it's not primarily an economic reality per se, but an operational reality within the law that binds Congress, that they have to find these offsets based on scores that CBO is coming up with. And I challenge you to look at what the interest rate projections are for CBO going back 10 years, and they're always wrong. So it really is a game of mathematics and computers delinked from reality, but that's the kind of crazy world that I deal with every day.
And that's why nothing gets done, I think, in a lot of cases, because you have people that don't have that level of actuarial experience trying to design programs that then when they hit the road don't work. And for those that are not terribly involved in this area, Medicare is a purely federal program, and there has been expansion of the Medicare Advantage plans with some long-term care fringe activity. Where do you see Medicare going in this area?
Well, it's hard to say. One of the issues is that the jurisdictions are split between Medicaid and Medicare on the House side. I will say this, that Medicare Advantage companies have a very strong influence in Congress. And so what we have seen is they get to do all these fancy things, and Medicare, regular Medicare and Medigap do not. And part of the game you're seeing with let's include long-term care and Medicare Advantage is basically a long-term effect to make Medicare Advantage more attractive to individuals. But I can say, oh.
And it's an entitlement. Medicare is an entitlement program. Medicaid is not. Medicaid is an impoverishment program. Both came in 1965. Yeah. Unfortunately, long-term care or long-term services and supports have primarily been pushed into the Medicaid program, which from a financing standpoint is states and the federal government, and in New York, a county share of Medicaid. We're one of the few states that has a county share to pay for those things. And it's almost 50% of the New York state budget. The New York share of Medicaid, our home care program has been more generous. When I speak around the country and I tell people what we have in New York for home care, they're incredulous. They say, how do you get those benefits? It comes at a cost, and that's the cost of taxation. So in terms of that, you mentioned the Class Act, which kind of came and went and was actuarially unsound, didn't make it, which was a financing system for long-term care. Dual eligibles seem to get the best of all worlds. They have Medicare, sometimes Medicare Advantage, they have Medicaid, and they have caseworkers who actually blend those benefits to give them a consistent system of healthcare and long-term care. Any movement towards that kind of a more of a dual eligible program? So
I think that there's a lot of interest because doing these, again, this goes back to when we were trying to defend the system as it exists, Medicaid. And I believe it was called Medicaring. I'd have to look it up, but how do we take all these different payment systems that we have now? Another one that Senator Gillibrand mentioned is the Older Americans Act. Have all these disparate programs that are providing services and care, and they're basically funnels to the states. How do you take what we have now and try to graft that together? It's complicated, but the Alterum Institute is a group that is very interested in that kind of work to find, again, a next step to make things better.
Well, you mentioned the Compact for Long-Term Care, and we're going to hear from Gail Holubinka later this morning. The Compact actually does rationalize all of those payment sources because it leaves individuals responsible for their health care using their Medicare and Medicare Advantage and having long-term care, purely the long-term care component, subsidized once they have met a pledge, not an impoverishment pledge, but a pledge of a rational amount of assets and income. So we'll get to that later in the morning, and hopefully in our breakout session, we'll be discussing those alternative solutions as well. But you mentioned something in New York that raised a lot of issues, and that is estate recovery. And in New York, when they opened up estate recovery, New York enacted a full estate recovery statute, and they were going to recover against everything, trusts, life estates, every type of asset. We lobbied, the Bar Association, the New York State Bar Elder Law Section, and the New York State NAELA chapter lobbied very hard, and that was actually, believe it or not, repealed. And so we have a more limited estate recovery statute now, but Medicaid is a borrowed program. You get the assistance, but everything you have is coming back in at the end. That's probably a pretty popular idea in some circles.
It is. I think what's interesting about estate recovery, and I think this goes to the politics of elder law, if you look at the dollars saved, it's much less than what people claim. It's actually more of a moral claim, and getting people angry that individuals are unfairly using, say, a poverty system. When you look at the dollars, getting rid of, for instance, getting rid of it or making it optional might be $3 billion over 10 years for the federal government. In the size and scope of the federal government, that's actually not a lot of money. And I think we're spending that much on money follows the person already. So some of the politics are less are more about an unfairness view, depending on your moral viewpoint. However, as we've discussed, state budget constraints
Mhm.
are going to be a major issue going forward. Now, I grew up in Florida, so I'm very aware of my step grandfather who had a great pension from the New York teachers in New York City and Long Island, who could come down with a very high pension and go to a very low tax jurisdiction. And because Medicaid and states have to play off against each other, I also live in the DC area. We have Virginia, which is a much more low tax state. You see all the businesses. That's where Amazon is. Because of that game, I think it's going to make it difficult for states. Again, and you see this issue around revenues, and I think New York, particularly with like the SALT cap repeal, it's going to make things more challenging.
Yeah. David, thank you.